Hello class, right back at it now, starting here with chapter 4, which is labeled Tour of the Cell. So chapter 4, we're actually going to start jumping into biology and talking about some biological concepts, and specifically looking at our most smallest form of life, which is the cell form. And we're going to kind of see what different things the cell is made up of, what different mechanisms, different things that go on in the cell, how they go on, how they're beneficial for the life of the cell, and everything in that nature. But before we can dive right into that, we kind of have to know a little bit about the two types of cells that are out there. So all of life is made up of cells. And we have these two different types of cells. And the first one is called prokaryotes. All right, so prokaryotes are very simple cells. Most of the time they are single cellular organisms. And so when we think of prokaryotic cells, so we'll call them prokaryotic, we think of things like bacteria, and archaeans. Now, in a later chapter, we'll talk a lot more about bacteria and archaeans and more about them, but that's going to be closer near the end of the semester. But we just want to talk about, so prokaryotes are assumed to be the oldest form of cells. So when we talked earlier about that single cellular life form that lived in the ocean, this was a prokaryotic type of cell. And when we break this down into Latin, the pro, it's pretty much saying prokaryon. And the pro means before, and karyon refers to nucleus. And so one of the things we know about prokaryotes is that they don't have a nucleus. And we're going to talk specifically what a nucleus is, what the importance of a nucleus is in our other types of cells here in a minute. And so when we think of the difference between prokaryotes and our second type of cell, which is our eukaryotes, our prokaryotes tend to be more simple. Simple, not complex. And I say not complex, but I don't think I've told you guys yet, but my area in expertise in biology is microbiology and specific virology. And actually, when you look at bacteria and you look at things like viruses and archaeans, they actually are very complex. But when you compare them to a eukaryote or a eukaryotic cell, they aren't nearly as complex. And so our eukaryotes, mainly these are cells that we find in animals, plants, fungi, and protista. And we're going to speak more about how each one of these cells are different, whether it's an animal cell, plant cell, fungi cell, or protista cell, also later on in the semester. But what we're going to focus mainly on today and in this chapter is the eukaryotic cell. So just like in our prokaryotic cell, we had our prokaryon, here we have our eukaryon. And the U actually stands for good. And once again, karyon is nucleus. So eukaryote really means good nucleus, and what that's referring to is that it does have a nucleus. So our prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus. Our prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus. Our eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. And since we are animals, all the cells in our body that make up us are eukaryotes. And so one way I always remembered when I was in my biology class when I was a freshman so many years ago, the difference between a prokaryote and eukaryote. So if I was trying to figure out, are more complex cells eukaryotes or prokaryotes, I'd always say you are a eukaryote. In other words, you're an animal, you're very complex, your cells are very complex, and so eukaryotes are the more advanced, more complex. So more advanced and more complex. So earlier I was talking about how our prokaryotes were the first form of life on Earth, and they were roughly about 3.5 billion years ago. So billion with a B, B-Y-A, billion years ago. And our eukaryotes, they showed up roughly 2.1 billion years ago. So you have over a billion years where life was only in this prokaryotic stage. But then later on, it became, some of it evolved into these eukaryotes, which once again we'll also talk about later at the end of the semester, into these more complex type of cells. All right, and then like I said, we're really only going to be focused on our eukaryotes right now because they're more complex, they have more things that we can talk about, and they are a little bit more specific to who we are. And since we like to learn more about who we are as humans, that's why we're going to focus mainly on our eukaryotes today when we look at our different types of eukaryotic cells. And mainly we'll focus on animal cells, but we'll also do a little bit about plant cells. We won't really talk too much about fungi and protista cells because they're very similar to these other ones. And really the animal cells and the plant cells are the ones that have a lot of the same things, but 2 or 3 specific things that are different between them that we're going to be talking about. All right, so when we're talking about cells, the first thing we actually need to talk about is what we call the membrane structure. And this membrane structure is really talking about the part of the cell that is the outer layer of it, right? What makes a cell, right? That anything inside this layer, this membrane, is the cell. Anything outside this membrane is the outside of the cell. So we're going to first talk about membrane structure. And what we know is that all of our prokaryotic cells, their membrane structures are made up of a phospholipid. They're made up of phospholipids. So we need to think back to our last chapter where we talked about different macromolecules. And one of the things we talked about was fats and oils and steroids. And we drew a couple of them. And a phospholipid is very unique in that it's kind of one of those, it's a lipid, so it's an oil, like a fatty oil. And what it does is it has a head. So we talked about this earlier, that our fats have a head and then they have tails. And in our phospholipids, there's one tail that's straight, and then there's another tail that kind of bends off like this. And one thing we talked a lot about when we looked at our fats and oils and our steroids, and what they all had in common is that they were hydrophobic, right? Remember, scared of water? Well, our phospholipids are a little bit different. So yes, they still are scared of water, but only in this section here. Only the tails are scared of water. In the head, they have something we call phosphogroups. And these phospho groups kind of look something like this. Just going to draw so this head section right here kind of looks like this. Has this big phosphate group in it, has some oxygens, and has another oxygen, then it has a nitrogen. I don't know if you can see this, but I didn't draw this very well, but this nitrogen has a positive on it. So because it has a positive on it, it actually likes to interact with water. So we've talked multiple times about how water is polar, has those partial positives and partial negatives, and how water loves to interact with things that also have positives and negative charges. And so what we find out here is that the head, so once again, these are the tails, that the head of our phospholipid is actually what we call hydrophilic. And hydrophilic is water loving. So philic, hydro, once again, water. Philic is love. So if you think of like Philadelphia, so we call that the city of brotherly love. That's what that phili part stands for, is love. And so the tail of our phospholipid is hydrophobic, but the head of our phospholipid is hydrophilic. And this is very interesting because one part is hydrophobic and one part is hydrophilic. They're going to interact differently if you put them in the water. So in other words, if I were to take a handful of phospholipids and throw them into the water, and let's say this white paper here is going to be our water, they're going to interact with each other. They're going to interact with the water differently. So we're going to have something like this. So here's our hydrophilic head with the hydrophobic tails. So we have a lot of these. And what's going to happen is our hydrophilic heads are going to want to interact with each other because they all are water loving. And our hydrophobic tails are also going to be next to each other because they are hydrophobic or water scared or water hating, if you want to say it that way. And so let's say we have H2O here, right? H2O here. So this is water once again. Well, what's the problem now is these tails now they're still, like here, this is fine. Water, they love water. These heads love working with the water, but these tails don't. And so then what you have is another layer. So you start to create this one layer where they all love the water, these hydrophilic heads, but then you're going to actually create another layer below it where these hydrophobic tails are going to start to interact with each other. And so what ends up happening now is only your hydrophilic heads of your phospholipid are interacting with the water because they love the water. And now you're protecting your hydrophobic tails away from the water. So they're coming together to get away from the water. And you're probably thinking, well, yeah, but now the water can come in and get here. And this is where it gets interesting, is when you do this, these will actually create a ring. And so you can imagine here, these are a whole bunch of phospholipids with all the heads up here. I'm not going to draw all these out. Or down here, And all the tails, I'm just going to do it this way, are in the middle. And so what does that end up creating? This now creates the structure of a cell. So here you have the outside of a cell, and you have inside. And that is how we create the membrane structure of a cell, through these phospholipids, because they interact with water based on whether they are the heads that are hydrophilic or the tails, which are hydrophobic, and you end up creating now this pseudo cell structure, right? Where you have an inside and outside, with water being on the inside and water being on the outside, and only these hydrophilic heads interacting with the water and the hydrophobic tails hiding from the water, creating this layer. So because we have two layers of phospholipids, we call this something very specific. We call it a phospholipid bilayer. Now the word bi means two. All right, so we have phospholipid, two layers of phospholipids that now create this membrane structure for our cells. Now, an interesting thing about it is this is just, like I said before, a pseudo membrane. Pseudo means kind of like not a real membrane. It just looks like one, or it's like fake. Pseudo means not quite real. And that's because a real cell membrane has this phospholipid bilayer, but it also has other things embedded into this phospholipid bilayer to help it. And that's how we end up creating what we call the cell membrane. And so I'm going to draw a picture of a proper cell membrane here. Sometimes you'll hear this called the plasma membrane. But same thing, cell membrane, plasma membrane. I might use both words interchangeably like I do with other terms, but realize I'm talking about the same thing. And so this plasma membrane is going to be a little bit more complex than just this phospholipid bilayer that we created here. It's going to have this, but it's also going to have things that are embedded inside of it. Now I hope as I'm drawing this that you guys will also draw this, because this will give you an opportunity to remember what's going on, like how does this actually work. So definitely take some time here and draw this with me, even if you have to pause the video and create your own membrane here. All right, so there's our phospholipid bilayer. Now we're going to add in some other things. All right, so these green things here, these are actually what we call proteins. And within our cell membrane, so once again, here we had our phospholipid bilayer. Now we have our phospholipid bilayer, and you have these proteins that are embedded into it. And these proteins will do different type of things. So some of these proteins might be like a channel protein. And its job is to let things in and out of the cell. Okay, so really our cell membrane is to kind of regulate what goes in and out of the cell, and it will do this with a lot of these proteins. So let's say both of these here are our channel proteins. Maybe this one only lets things in. This one here lets things in or out, and maybe just for good measure we can draw a third one over here. And let's say this one only lets things out. So this is our, let's just complete this a little bit. So there we now have our cell membrane. And like I said, inside these cells, you have these proteins that are embedded. Some are these channel proteins that allow things in and out, or just in or just out. And we'll talk more about the importance of that and how that's regulated. Then we also have these like signaling proteins. So this is like a protein here saying, hey, I've got a signal, this is how I can interact with other cells, or this is how I can interact with the environment around me. And then we also have proteins that are signal cells that are on the inside. So here, this would be the outside of the cell. And here would be the inside. And the inside of the cell, we often refer to that as the cytosol or cytoplasm. Okay, anytime I say cytosol or cytoplasm, I'm talking about that liquid, the water liquid, because we have water in here and we also have water out here. That watery liquid inside the cell, we call that the cytoplasm or the cytosol, depending on which book you're reading. And then we have our, like I said, our cell membrane here. And the job of the cell membrane, the main job of the cell membrane is to regulate what comes in and out of the cell. All right, so that is the main job of our cell membrane, is it regulates what comes in and out of the cell. And it does that through these channel proteins, where if you are just a regular phospholipid bilayer, only certain things can come in and out of this, and they have to be pretty small because they have to go in between these lipids here. And we'll actually see how sometimes water and other things can do that. But your cell needs, big things like nutrients and food particles and sugars and all that kind of stuff to stay alive. And so these things are much bigger, and so they've got to be able to try to get in and out of the cell. And so they do that through these what we like to call transmembrane proteins, or these channel proteins. We'll just call them channel proteins. And so that's the important part of our cell membrane, is that it regulates what comes in and out of the cell. And this is how you keep bad things out of the cell. This is how you keep good things in the cell. Or as what will, some of the things that we do, like when we create energy in the cell, sometimes it creates bad byproducts, and so we need to excrete those or get rid of those. And so that's also where those things will come out of the cell. And so this is really important, the cell membrane, with this structure, with these proteins, because it regulates the moving of these good and bad molecules in and out of the cell, so that the cell can be in homeostasis, or can be happy, can be in a state that allows it to be safe and good and move forward. So that's our cell membrane. In some cells, specifically our plant cells, they also have a cell membrane, but plant cells also have something else. We call it a cell wall. And so we're going to talk really quickly about our plant cell wall. And because plant cells have cell walls, plant cells almost are always either square or rectangle in shape. And so I'm going to draw our plant cell here. And this is going to be, this black here is our phospholipid bilayer. So I'm drawing two layers. So this is that cell membrane. So just like we just drew, has proteins embedded and all that kind of stuff. So this is our cell membrane. But then plant cells have also their cell wall. And once again, plants are going to be square because of this cell wall, or rectangle. And the reason for that is because this cell wall is actually pretty sturdy. All right, so it's strong. It's made out of cellulose. If you remember when we talked about cellulose, it's a carbohydrate that has that special bond in it that can't be broken. And because of that special bond that can't be broken by our immune systems, our digestive systems, sorry. And because of that, it makes it very strong. And that's what gives it that sturdy effect here. So because of that, it's not fluid. So when we look at animal cells, we usually will see them in like kind of circular and oblong type of shapes, because the plasma membrane is very fluid and it can kind of move around, where our plant cell is very much stuck in this shape because of this cellulose cell wall that is very strong and sturdy and keeps it in this square shape. In fact, it's kind of interesting, the first guy who discovered cells was actually looking at like some leaf cells underneath a microscope. And when he saw them, he saw all these little squares right next to each other. And what he said is, he said, oh, these look like prison cells. And actually that's where the word cell comes from, is because he thought these little plants were made up of these small prison cells, in a sense. Not made up of small prison cells, but looked like these small prison cells. And that's why we call cells cells, which is kind of interesting. Where if he were to been looking at like an animal cell or something like that, they would have been more circular, and he probably wouldn't have called them cells, and we might have been calling them something else, oblongs or circles, or whatever he decided to call them. But these plants, like I said, have these cell walls. Now these cell walls also, they protect the cell. Maintains its shape. So we've kind of talked about that. My gosh, my spelling is off today. Maintains shape. And it also limits how much water can actually be inside the cell. So if you think of like a water balloon, if you continue to put water inside that water balloon, you can keep filling it up and 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 up. Finally, probably what's going to happen is that water balloon is going to burst. All right. So that can actually happen to animal cells, because they don't have a cell wall. If you made a situation where you just kept putting water and water into an animal cell, it would burst. Now it has mechanisms to kind of get out some of the water. So that usually doesn't happen, but there are times where you hear people who drink too much water, and you can actually die from drinking too much water, because you're actually putting more water in your cells, and then those cells will burst. Well, that doesn't happen with a plant cell, because of this rigid cell wall structure. As you put water into this cell, it will blow up. So kind of think of this maybe more as like a juice box, right? So you're almost going to be limited on how much water you could put in that juice box, because the juice box is made up of cardboard, and it's a little bit stronger than that latex that your balloon is made up of. And so you're going to be limited on how much water can actually go into this. And the interesting thing about this as well is that plants not only need water to live like we do, and using in all these different things that we're going to talk about later on this next week, but plants also need water for structure. So let's say you have some house plants at your house, and you're going to go on vacation. Well, you forget to call your neighbor to come over and water your house plants while you're gone on vacation. Let's say you're gone for just over a week and a half. You come back and all your house plants are going to be drooped over. And so you freak out, you run, go get some water, put some water in the soil, and then within probably the next day or day and a half, all of a sudden the house plant will start to stand back up. And the reason for that is the water that is in these cells actually put pressure on these walls and make it so they're nice and sturdy. So plants don't have skeletons, and so they rely on the water pressure pushing against the cell wall to get it nice and sturdy. So when you left your house and you forgot to have someone water your plant, that water was used for other things in the cell to keep it alive, and then that water came less and less and less because it wasn't getting new water in. And then just kind of like that juice box, it started to crumble in a little bit, and now it didn't have any support because there's no water in it to cause that pressure. And so that's when your plants start to droop. So cell bars are kind of cool in that sense, because it does provide that structure for those plants. All right, so I'm going to be switching over to the whiteboard here now, because we're going to actually draw out our animal cells. We'll probably refer back to this picture, maybe put some things in here in this picture for our plant cell. So once again, cell walls are only in plant cells. But really now we're going to focus more on animal cells and all the different things that are in them.